Blessed is the name of the book. A History of the American Prosperity Gospel is a subtitle. Duke University Professor of Religion Kate Bowler is the author. Professor Bowler, what is the prosperity gospel?
It's an offshoot of Pentecostalism that developed a special vocabulary for how exactly faith reaches out into the invisible and brings back material things.
What is Pentecostal?
So Pentecostalism is a movement that sprang up in the early 20th century. It was kind of rough and tumble, openness to spiritual gifts that usually centers on the power of God to be spoken through what they call glossolalia, so spiritual tongues. But it's really a kind of signs and wonders mentality that God is just around the corner. You just have to keep your eyes open. And so the prosperity gospel is one version of that that looks for slightly different things than traditional Pentecostalism.
So when you say things, does the prosperity gospel mean wealth if you follow this way?
Sure, they're surprisingly material. I mean, Pentecostals were material too. They said that the body was God's home. It was one of the most kind of profoundly American things you could say. You're not just an individual do-it-yourself bootstrapper. You're someone that can be a manifestation of God's very presence. So the prosperity gospel took that to say, well, this can be interpreted even more concretely, not just in your health, which has been a kind of historic Christian tenet, but also in your finances. And so they developed more and more vocabulary to help Christians think through how every little detail in their life was actually proof that God was there.
Is this uniquely American?
I think in some ways it's a kind of indigenous American gospel. It's rugged individualism. It is supernatural bootstraps. It has an incredibly high anthropology, and there's no meaning, a kind of sense of what people can do. And there's really no nation that seems more confident in what they can accomplish than this one.
Who are some of the preachers of the prosperity gospel? And do they call it the prosperity gospel?
Yeah, well, that's such a tough question. Some of the preachers I would include as, the most popular are Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, Joyce Meyer, Creflo Dollar, Frederick Price. Really, everywhere there is a megachurch and a local celebrity, you will find a prosperity preacher. But the term itself is very controversial. No one wants to be called a prosperity preacher. And that was kind of the burden of writing this book, is how do you lump people in that would naturally resist that kind of label?
Did some of those ministers participate in your book?
They did. I managed to visit a quarter of all of what I identified as prosperity megachurches. I interviewed someone representing the ministry from almost every major ministry. I went to every major conference. I was the annoying person pressed up against the glass at every conference, hoping to get a glimpse of what was going on.
And what did you hear? What kind of message are these churches preaching?
I think what surprised me the most was that it wasn't so much about money. I thought naturally the prosperity gospel, money is one of its most surprising claims. Surely this is a gospel about money. And what I found was that people didn't talk about money nearly as much as I expected them to. The kind of excitement that they had was that every special detail was given God's attention. Not just the kind of God in every empty parking space sort of mentality, but that their budgets, their families, their marriages, their happiness, their promotions, that every little part of their lives were worthy of spiritual attention.
And what does that have to do with prosperity? I mean, is it more than just a wealth prosperity?
So they will call it a whole life prosperity. And I guess, in theological terms, we would say something like, critics would call it a more overly realized eschatology, meaning that we'll see more of the presence of the kingdom of God here on earth, when traditionally Christians have thought that most of the good stuff happens after we die.
Well, Kate Bowler, isn't it in the Bible something, and I'm paraphrasing, but what you give, God gives back tenfold? So
the search for the numbers is a tricky one. Most of the hard numbers people will get from teasing out parts of covenant theology throughout the Old Testament. There's a few concrete, there's some biblical numbers, 3s, 7s, apparently 100s, but people are looking, the desire for numbers is mostly a desire to look for a spiritual formula. What is it? Where can we find that key that unlocks God's bank? And so where there is a number, Revelation, some of the apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament, there they will try to find and tease out formulas. But for the most part, prosperity preachers have tried to shy away from numbers, in part because there's a greater sense that though the theology says, well, more begets more, that we actually do live in a relatively concrete financial universe, and we can't promise everyone 100-fold on every return.
These megachurches, and why megachurches?
I guess megachurches were easier because there was already a database of the 1,600 or so megachurches that exist in the country. So what I could do then was to go through every single one and every single website and pull them out and make my own lists based on shared rhetoric, shared institutional connections. They tend to go to the same conferences, get accredited honorary doctorates from the same schools. I figured then if they look and talk and walk like a prosperity duck in this case, then I can lump them together on my own as a prosperity movement.
Did the megachurches become megachurches because they preached this prosperity gospel?
It's an excellent question. I mean, the relationship between fundraising and a large church they seem to be kind of natural allies in many senses. We will sometimes find a smaller church who takes on a prosperity theology and then so becomes a prosperity megachurch. But we shouldn't confuse megachurches and the prosperity gospel. So there's 1,600 or so megachurches in the country, and only a minority of them are prosperity megachurches. What's most unusual about them, though, is that they really dominate the upper tier of churches. So the biggest of the big churches in the country preach a message, and their influence is enormous. They could be thought of sort of like the top of a feudal pyramid, where they have all sorts of people under them that preach a similar message, that look to them for inspiration, and so their message spreads far beyond what you might expect a local preacher could do.
Lakewood Church, Joel Osteen, self-reported attendance, 38,000. That's an average weekly attendance.
Yeah, that's right.
Houston, Texas. World Changers Ministries, Creflo Dollar, 30,000. College Park, Georgia. The Potter's House, T.D. Jakes, 30,000. Dallas, Texas. Are those prosperity gospel churches, those top three?
Yeah, absolutely. So any of the ones that I listed in the appendices as a kind of helpful shorthand to where to find these churches are all prosperity churches, and most of them will make the top 50 of the largest churches in the country.
All tax exempt?
They are entrepreneurial in spirit. The churches themselves are tax exempt, but what they typically do if they're very famous is they split their churches into for-profit and not-for-profit wings. So T.D. Jakes has T.D. Jakes Church / Potter's House and T.D. Jakes Enterprises. And he's a great example because he's a producer, probably a writer, a film writer, and has all kinds of fingers in different pots.
And that's the profit side or the taxable side?
That's right. And so they'll say, well, don't look at me necessarily as an example of someone who's taking the money out of the coffers. I actually make most of my money from this other wing. And that is sometimes true for some, and it's less true for others. They don't really have to justify how much money they make, in part because of the theological infrastructure of the movement. All they have to say is, look, I did it, and I can show you how to do it too. More is more, and I can just show you the way.
Somebody who spoke at President Bush's, W. Bush, inaugural, Kirby John Caldwell, Windsor Village United Methodist Church, 14,000 attendance, Houston, Texas.
It's one of the big surprises, I think, of the prosperity movement, and why it took me so long to write this book, is in order to demonstrate really how widespread it is, we have to take into account not just the kind of stereotypical prosperity megachurches, which are non-denominational, but some of the denominational ones that in almost every major American denomination, we find at least one prosperity megachurch. So that could include the United Methodists, adorable as they are, the Disciples of Christ. We're just shy of a Presbyterian megachurch, I'm sure, somewhere out there.
When did this prosperity gospel, well, first of all, is there a political philosophy with these churches? Do they talk politics?
They do, but it's a kind of subset. We can think of them as having different niches. You're the spiritual warfare guy, you're the prophecy lady, you're the politics dude. And for this, we'll find a John Hagee, a Rod Parsley, that there'll be a subset that will overlap with the Christian right. But for the most part, they don't really need to talk nuts and bolts with with politics, because God has offered them an end run around the systems that oppress them. So really what they need to do is get serious about their faith, and then doors will open.
When did